Okay, let's talk about dopamine. What is dopamine? Dopamine is what's called a neuromodulator, which simply refers to the fact that it's a chemical that modulates or changes the electrical activity of other cells. And the cells I'm referring to are neurons. Neurons are just nerve cells. So you have a brain and a spinal cord, and the neurons in your brain and spinal cord connect to one another, and they connect to different areas of the body, including basically every organ of your body. And every organ of your body communicates back to your brain and spinal cord through direct or indirect pathways. For instance, you have neurons in your gut that sense what sorts of nutrients you've eaten or drank, and then send neural signals, electrical signals, up to the brain. And indeed, that whole process happens to be modulated by dopamine. Dopamine as a neuromodulator has the basic property of either ramping up, increasing, or decreasing the activity of other neurons. And that's done by adjusting things like electrical potentials and things of that sort that we really won't go into this episode, but that I promise to get into in detail in a future episode if you're interested in the biochemistry and biophysics of neurons and things of that sort. So we have this neuromodulator, dopamine, and we know that that neuromodulator can increase or decrease the activity of other neurons. So then we have to ask ourselves, where is dopamine released in the brain and body, and what specific types of neurons is it impacting? In other words, what specific types of functions does dopamine have? So there are basically 5 circuits within the brain that use dopamine as the primary neuromodulator, and those 5 circuits engage different but related functions. So I'm going to go through them one by one relatively quickly, giving you a little bit of nomenclature and some sense of what each of those circuits looks like and what it does. The first circuit is the so-called nigrostriatal pathway. So in the back of the brain, there's an area called substantia nigra, so named because the neurons there are actually very dark. They actually contain pigment. You'd be able to see this if I were to slice up a brain. You'd see 2 dark regions in the back. That's substantia nigra. Substantia nigra contains neurons that are chock-a-block full of dopamine, but they release that dopamine in a brain structure called the striatum. The striatum is involved in movement, both the initiation of movements and the suppression of movements, in so-called go, action, and no-go, suppress action pathways, a topic for a future podcast. The second brain circuit that uses and leverages dopamine to a great extent is the so-called mesolimbic pathway. Now, you'll also in a moment hear about the mesocortical pathway. So today I'm going to talk about these somewhat interchangeably at times, but where it's important for me to differentiate between them, I will do that. Both of these pathways initiate from a set of neurons in the so-called ventral tegmental area, or VTA. I will use that acronym, VTA. The VTA functions in close partnership with a different brain structure called the nucleus accumbens, or NA. I don't think I'll call it NA today. I'll talk about VTA, ventral tegmental area, and I'll talk about nucleus accumbens. For sake of today's discussion, you can lump those together if you want. Neurons in those areas project a bunch of different places, but in the mesolimbic pathway, those neurons are projecting to areas of the brain like the hypothalamus, which sits right above the roof of your mouth and is responsible for a lot of basic functions, things like maintaining your body temperature, for libido and the pursuit of sex, for hunger, for the generation of signals to the pituitary gland that cause the release of hormones and other things into the bloodstream. So the connections, which I sometimes refer to as projections, from the neurons in the VTA and nucleus accumbens to the hypothalamus are basically using dopamine to modulate the output of a lot of different things that happen in this hypothalamus that controls a lot of, we could call them primitive functions, but they're really basic functions for survival. Now, the other pathway out of the VTA and nucleus accumbens is to the cortex. That's why it's called mesocortical pathway. So this is a very different pathway out of the VTA and nucleus accumbens than the one I just described a moment ago. The pathway I'm talking about now, the mesocortical pathway, projects to the prefrontal cortex, which is a structure that many of you have perhaps heard of, but even if you haven't, it's important to know this is an area that resides right behind your forehead, and that in humans, compared to other species, is greatly expanded in terms of its size and complexity of function. So it's involved in everything from planning and executing of action to making good or bad decisions depending on context. In fact, one of the primary functions of prefrontal cortex is to really understand context, whether or not, for instance, you are alone in your room where certain behaviors are appropriate, whether or not you are at work where other behaviors are appropriate. Understanding what the context is, and therefore what sorts of actions need to be generated and suppressed. In fact, a guest on the Huberman Lab podcast, and this is a guest whose episode hasn't aired yet, described this beautifully. He's a neurosurgeon, and he said, the way to think about the prefrontal cortex is it's basically an area of the brain that says shh or no, not now, to other brain regions in order to suppress action. And we know this because people that have damage to the prefrontal cortex often can't suppress their impulses. Okay, so the pathway from VTA and nucleus accumbens to the prefrontal cortex is absolutely critical for today's discussion because we are largely going to be discussing motivation, drive, pursuit, procrastination, and all sorts of things that have to do with our feelings about context, whether or not we want to do something or not, whether or not we feel we should or we shouldn't, whether or not we feel we failed the last time or there's a high probability of success the next time. Prefrontal cortex does many, many things, but when thinking about dopamine's role in the prefrontal cortex, that is, when thinking about this mesocortical pathway, we really want to think about how dopamine is activating or changing our propensity to do certain things and get us into action, or prevent us from doing certain things and prevent action. So basically, you can think about the mesocortical pathway as a circuit that really governs all of the major choices that you're going to make in life about what to do and what not to do toward your goals and away from the things that you want to avoid. Now, the fourth dopamine pathway in the brain is the so-called tuberoinfundibular pathway. And this is not one we're going to focus on too much today. This is a pathway that relates to connections between the brain and your pituitary gland. Your pituitary gland being that gland that's, as I mentioned a moment ago, is also receiving input from the hypothalamus and is releasing a bunch of hormones into your bloodstream, things like luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, things like melanocortin hormone. These are hormones that are impacting everything from the function of the ovary in females to the function of the testes in males. It's governing things like cortisol release under stress, thyroid hormone, meaning it's regulating thyroid hormone release, and on and on. Dopamine has a very powerful impact on the output of the pituitary. So again, that's probably a topic for a future episode, but it's important in reviewing the different brain circuits that use dopamine as a neuromodulator that I mentioned that one. Then there's a fifth one, and this fifth one is not often discussed, and again, won't be the main topic of today's discussion, but for thoroughness and for clarity, it's important that we mention it. This is the circuit within your retina, that is the pie crust-like lining of neural tissue on the back of your eye, because remember, your eye is actually part of your brain that got extruded from your brain during development. You know, those two eyes that you see in the mirror and that you see in other people are actually two pieces of central nervous system. And within the retina, which is the neural portion of the eye, within the neural retina, dopamine is responsible for adapting to different light conditions so that you can see clearly both in the evening and when it gets darker, you can still see a bit. And in the morning when it's very bright, you don't really have to make adjustments to your visual system in order to see clearly. Your visual system does it for you. And one of the ways that it does that is through the neuromodulator dopamine. So today we are not going to discuss the retinal dopamine pathways or the tuberoinfundibular dopamine pathways. And we won't really talk so much about the nigrostriatal pathway. I'll say one more thing about it and then I'll leave it alone. We are going to talk about the mesocortical pathway, and we might touch on the mesolimbic pathway a little bit as well.